Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome back to the MineWarp podcast. This is, of course, the podcast where I, MP Strydom, your host, talk with innovators and investors and the implementers of the technology shaping the future of mining and other heavy industries. Today, we've got a new guest for you, Jason van der Walt. He is from AVA Solutions, and I'll let him introduce himself in a little bit more detail. Before I do that, I'd like to ask you all to consider subscribing to the podcast as well, so that you don't miss any of the interesting guests and any of the episodes that we have to offer. So with that then, Jason, welcome to MineWarp.
Thanks, Impi. It's great to be here. I'm glad we could finally make the time to catch up officially on a podcast.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So, Jason, why don't you start by just telling us a little bit more about yourself? Maybe your background, where you're from, and so on, and then your professional background as well. Let's jump in with that.
Thanks, Impi. I grew up in Johannesburg, very much middle of the road. Went to a government school. I think the only there's quite a few great people that went there, but probably the most notable is Trevor Noah. So
right.
we're known for having good sense of humor at Sandringham High, and it was definitely a great melting pot for different cultures and languages, and so that really set the scene. Then I went on to Wits to study industrial engineering. So
Right.
I started as aeronautical with the dream of making surfboards and yachts. And then I realized I'd actually have to get a job one day. So I thought rather than doing that and moving on to an MBA, it would be better to switch across to industrial engineering and really start to understand business improvement. And the culture around business improvement was something else. And we had some really incredible lecturers. From organizational management to also operations research. And the combination of these two things can just unlock incredible value in businesses. And so that put me on a good footing. And we know South Africa's mining heavy. So that's the industry you want to get into. And being an entrepreneur at heart, I wanted to start a business, but I also recognized that there's not many people that will buy a product from a university graduate straight out the gates. So it's probably best that I get some work experience. And so I joined a company called Business Science Corporation, BSC. I think at that time they were called SciEst. Quite an innovative company. And it was really formative because I got flung into this world of doing modeling for some of the major miners. From Anglo Gold Ashanti to Anglo American. Before I knew it, I was in Brazil modeling the offtake streams for fertilizer businesses for the and looking at how if you have a pool on one certain product, it actually ends up splitting into multiple different offtake streams for phosphates, because you've got all sorts of things from sulfuric acid and phosphoric acid and all the different products that can come from it and byproducts. So it really taught me about material flows and what are the key drivers behind business. Things like Anglo Gold, that was at the time Mark Kodafani was steering the ship. And you got to see at an aggregated portfolio level what pulling a small lever like stope width would have on the entire business. And I think it was then that I learned, if you can just intelligently move this one lever slightly higher, it can have this incredible impact on the entire profitability. And some of them are counterintuitive. And I'd almost argue that the only real value in business improvement is counterintuitive results.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. I also saw that you guys have, the value driver tree capabilities built into your software. And I'm going to bring us back to that a little bit later on, because I'm always interested when software people are cognizant of and aware of tracking value as opposed to tracking features and functions only. But I don't want to derail the discussions before we get there.
Oh, I mean,
Okay.
that kind of speaks to the journey.
Yeah.
It's presented with a deck of 15 different time models that were present in both Anglo-American and Anglo-Gold. And
Yeah.
and you can spend hours arguing about the definition of a time model. And
Mm,
yet, if they stitch together, there's fudge factors in all of them that don't really allow you to make the great decisions off the data.
mm,
So
mm,
so that was a great journey in terms of determining how do you make wooden dollars, right? Wooden
mm,
dollars are great for reporting. You can put them in a project pipeline and you can show everyone how many millions of dollars you've saved. But actually realizing those wooden dollars in terms of the bottom line, that's the hard part. And
mm,
that's when I made the decision to move to
mm,
South 32. At that time,
mhm,
we were still BHP Billiton
mm,
before we got demerged. And that process was quite interesting because I got to see the demerging process and how an organization can't change its identity overnight. And you were
mm,
stuck with the Marius Klopper's BHP people that are set
mm,
to group level documents defining how every aspect of an organization needs to run, but thrust into a new agile environment of kind of smaller commodities and smaller mines and a
mm,
proclaimed more agile operating model.
mm,
So that was a very transformative process because I had to realize that it's not that easy to make organizational change.
mm.
And that's also where I met Anton Fourie, who I started the business with.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So you met him at South 32 then, or this was before the split up, right?
During the split up. So,
During the split up.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm always interested in hearing entrepreneurial stories like this, as I know that many of the people are who listen, because I think even though mining sometimes has this bad reputation of being a slow innovator, it is such a highly uh, innovative industry. But changing that innovation into business, and growing that business, especially in the early days, through the up and down cycles of mining, is a real challenge. And so I just saw a link that someone posted yesterday on LinkedIn, an image that shows the amount of dollars or the percentage of in of money spent on innovation, as a percentage of revenue of mining and a variety of other industries, and mining was not faring too well there. So here's the question to you then. How were you able to make the leap?
Well, so I think I realized that we'd need experience to build trust and credibility with anyone that would take us on. And
Yeah.
having looked at how the business improvement process is normally conducted with the external consultants, we kind of
Mm,
arrived at this thinking that if we could make the right KPIs available to the right people at the right time, we could take a lot of the overhead in these big engagements out and we could make
mm,
good decisions with the data available. So with the demerger, there was also opportunity, and I think sometimes it's overlooked. But
mm.
the big corporate miners and their retrenchment packages are sometimes the most useful tools for starting new businesses because it
Yes.
gives you just a little bit of runway, and
Yeah.
sometimes that's what you need. So when the opportunities came up, I'd kind of already shifted to a special project at corporate,
Hmm.
and I begged and pleaded for my voluntary separation package, and together with that, I could string out 12 months of I wouldn't call it a salary, I would call it living expenses,
Yes.
and I think it was made slightly easier by being newly married but not having any kids at the time, and I
Mm,
could have a very small footprint.
mm, mm.
Um, So I think with that in hand and a bit of a clear idea about how we wanted to generate KPIs for open pit load and haul, that gave us enough of a go.
Yeah.
So
No, that's really interesting, and it's true. There is a lighter side to the employment cycles as well. So that's very good to hear. So just very quickly, I mean, you did industrial engineering, and of course, South Africa is a mining company, and it's kind of hard to avoid mining. Um, but in my mind, at least, industrial engineering is one of the, it's high in the crown of engineering degrees because it's so useful, and it is so widely applicable. So why mining? And why digital in mining, for that matter?
So I think there's probably a couple different business gurus that allude to the Venn diagram. And so if you were to take two industries and cross them, what would that intersection look like? I think mining's got an unfair stigma that it's a laggard in the digital and technology space.
Yes, absolutely.
But with that in mind, what a great place to try and introduce digital solutions. There was a little bit of a selfish motive around digital. I had call it a family friend with a business that was able to sell web themes online. And I was with them in Hermanus on Christmas one year. And he said, we're running a special. It's $75 for 2 themes this year. And I realized who can just create 2 of their product and charge the same amount? Their margin is still identical. They're just giving away 2 of a copy and paste.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, surely there's a way to build a scalable digital product that would work across all of these mines. So I was a little bit naive. I didn't have the full sales experience I do now and what it takes to build real trust and relationships with clients. But that was the idea, build highly scalable technology that could reduce the barrier to entry for a lot of tier 2 and tier 3 mines that don't have big BI teams and teams.
So that's a good segue into the question of, the specific business problems that you are trying to solve. And of course, different market segments have maybe not completely different problems, but different priorities in those problems, and also different appetites for actually addressing those problems, and different depth of pocket and so on. So you were talking about the tier 2, tier 3 miners. Tell us a little bit about the problem specifically that you want to solve with your company.
Well, I think a lot of our background comes from the major miners. Maybe one of your listeners can correct me, but I think somewhere between 11 and 14 billion metric tons a year is mined, excluding a lot of the bauxite and similar kind of commodities that aren't really tracked. But of that, those majors probably make up somewhere in our estimation between 80 and 16% of that total volume moved, which means there's this whole world of mining that's kind of just happening in the background. But they don't have the corporate overhead like asset optimization departments at corporate and analyze and improve roles that are structured into every single position where there's a mirrored position for every operational position. So surely they need business improvement more than anyone else. And I think it became personal when we started out in that first year, and there were 2 separate incidences of one level above production supervisor. So let's call it the kind of superintendent type role, but on the contractor side. So they're no longer a shift worker, but they're still always online. And it might be stereotyping, but often that individual would, when they're not working, they'd either be smoking or drinking and getting very little sleep. And I think it's easy to end up in a very negative mindset. And there's actually 2 cases of suicide by acquaintances of ours. And I thought, it doesn't need to be like this. There's smarter ways of doing this. Now I'm not trying to explain, mental health away and what other causes could be from that. But I do know that we shouldn't be creating these highly pressurized environments where it feels like there's no way out. And one of those instances was due to some misbilling on haul distances within the contractor and the feeling of accountability and not able to get out of that situation. And the other one was just kind of the general pressure of making sure that that they actually kept the contract and kept running. So we thought, if we can create transparency where both sides, the contractor and the mine, get to look at the same metrics, we can create a much healthier relationship. Because the number of KPIs, and it speaks back to the VDT, that you can drive where both parties win is just incredible. So, I mean, we've seen the most obvious one is fleet reduction, right? Moving more tons with same fleet or smaller. From average road speed, where maybe it's the mine owner's responsibility to control road conditions and the contractor is the one that suffers or benefits. And then obviously the classic touch point, which is the crusher, right? The crusher is where contractor meets miner. And when that crusher is running, you want it at 100% utilization. And so often there's not a cost benefit done for stockpiling in front of the crusher and feeding in with the front end loader. So there's all these kind of micro optimizations that make the relationship just so much better and everybody wins. And historically,
yeah, if you know, as you describe that, my mind fills with pictures of mining studies and you know, time and motion studies and all kinds of interesting things, but not immediately with software that solves it automatically. So how did you go from studying opportunities to building, or I almost want to say systematizing it into software?
I think the other fortunate benefit of South Africa is that we tend to have quite a lot of car theft, which has led to this, you know, some of the best telemetry and GPS devices in the world. I mean, really, the biggest suppliers in GPS tracking are out of the Eastern Bloc, Lithuania, South Africa, and a couple out of the States. And you know, we've got some really great companies in South Africa manufacturing great GPS tracking tools. And if you think about a GPS as a easy source of data and its exhaustive nature. So we initially did our first run with a company called Geotab, a South African founder that moved the business to Canada, and they had easily accessible APIs. And I think this was back in 2016. And so you could immediately generate value in their own platform. And well, and here's maybe a top tip for any aspiring entrepreneurs out there, is our web platform wasn't particularly good. And so what we had to do was build the airplane while flying, and at the same time generate enough value out of the underlying data from Geotab to be able to plug the gaps. So we were saying to the client, this is our future vision. This is where we want to go. We understand it's not quite there, but look at the analysis I've managed to do, and get them to kind of commit to the commercial model of the ongoing subscriptions.
And you started off as a kind of subscription model provider, as opposed to buy the software and off you go, right?
Yes, completely. Because it's an ongoing service, and it continuously solves the problem. Every day you generate new data. Every day we turn that into usable information and better decisions. And to process that, it just makes the whole system work.
So what would you say is the difference between better information, or just visibility of information, and operational intelligence?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And for me, the ability is to have an exhaustive time model. So there's no space to create time, right? If you drive one thing, you get a negative or positive impact in another environment. So, you know, if you spend longer changing your shift, you will have fewer operating hours, which is common knowledge. But what happens is when you stitch the data together, especially different forms of manual capture, you don't get a cohesive picture around that. And so taking something as simple as where is my truck, and turning it into a full overall equipment effectiveness model, it's, you know, that's the smarts, right? It's the same input data, but it's how you can then interpret that to make a big difference. And with that comes the sensitivity. You know, in a long cycle environment, you want more operating hours, and in a high cycle environment, you're probably going to get better bang for your buck if you look at, say, cycle delays, stationary time within a cycle. So we're trying to create that simplicity on the other side of the complexity, allow us to do all the heavy lifting on the calculating side, and get real business drivers.
The smaller mines, I think, just getting back to that again, you know, in typical business, there is this triangle, you know, where you've got lots and lots of smaller players at the base, and then fewer big companies at the top. Is that true in mining as well. So many people complain about not enough junior mines and so on. And I assume it opens the market into places like quarries, etc., as well, that are not always considered as mines.
Yeah, and that's and I think that's an interesting thing is quarries aren't necessarily always price takers. They kind of worked an order book. But what we see is huge amounts of inefficiency in quarries because they've got more, they often have more equipment capacity than they need, and they don't need all the time they have to fulfill their orders. So they end up naturally just running less efficiently to fulfill that order. Where actually in any kind of demand environment, what you want to do is when operating at, at 100% and then switching off, you don't want to have that variable cost continue longer than it needs to be. So we're seeing a huge impact in quarries as well. And I think the other thing that's interesting is with I suppose more so than critical minerals is rare earth minerals, is you're getting more junior miners that have multiple different commodities coming out of the same ore body, and that tending towards smaller mines. There's a big chase for copper, and there was all the various rumors about a Glencore Rio Tinto merger and the majors looking for the next big project. But I think at the same time, the renewables is driving this kind of smaller mine. And then going into some of these countries, mitigating risk is around using contractors. And contractors typically don't want to spend $1 more than they need to on any kind of hardware or equipment to tell them how to do their job better.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you immediately don't get those kind of insights that you would need. So I think what's happening is as a lower overhead form of continuous improvement is becoming the norm within contractors in tier twos and tier threes, we're starting to see those benefits.
So there's a kind of a democratizing of mining technology that's taking place, right?
I love that term, but it doesn't work so well for mining marketing. I've been told to park that one, but in our write-up, that's what we use: democratizing, data.
Okay, good, yeah. But speaking of that, a practical digital transformation at a mine. Many mining technology companies talk about transforming on the back of digital. How do you see your typical client? Where do they start and where do they end?
So, good question. I mean, I've got to give some credit to Exaro. It was one of our first big clients, and they put a big drive on digitalization. And part of that was a diverging process before they started to converge and say, okay, which solutions are adding the most value? So in that instance, a lot of it was like, we know we need to digitize. We're not quite sure of the net impact, but we're going to trust our people to try and work out how this data is used. And they're often in this position where they've got contractors that need to be managed or assisted. I think specifically in the South African context, we saw a lot of new contractors that weren't known to the market. They were trying to prove themselves to their own capital lenders that they could actually operate the equipment and therefore get more capital and grow their own fleets. So it creates this environment where both parties want to improve, and then we introduce the information, the data into that. I think the what you mentioned there is very interesting, is that we're kind of providing data that we still need people to act on. We're not changing the process of, dispatching the truck to a specific location. That came much later on, only in the last 3 or 4 years. And so people still have to want to change. So ideally, it does help if there is 1 or 2 business improvement people that want to pick up the data and run, and open-minded production miners, that can take it on board. And what we try to do is, in our customer journey, we bake in that cost benefit, because we understand there's not a department to run with it. So we'll actually look at the data, and every 3 months we say, these are the things we think you could focus on. And we'll keep those KPIs and come back and say, well, did you manage to make a change? So that's typically the kind of client that we'd like to work with. And interesting, you mentioned the quarries. When the way Afrimat dealt with it was very interesting. What they did is they said to the team, look, we're now measuring all the metrics. What do you think you could do? Make a pledge. Your queuing time is currently 2.5 minutes. What do you think
Okay.
it could be? And so the team would pledge and say, no, we think we could do 1.5 minutes. And you just watch the queuing time come down because they could actually be measured on the same scale. And across all 22 quarries, they could all be measured on the same scale. So suddenly you've got internal competition because the time
Almost a bit of a gamification going on.
standardized completely. And that's it. And so that little plan, do, check, act cycle is now incorporated into how they operate. And so they don't need the huge, project pipeline and all the rest because we've managed to localize that improvement cycle at the right level.
That's another way of saying short interval control if you are working at that time scale. So short interval control and fleet management are sometimes used kind of synonymously. How would you define those two terms? Maybe let's start with fleet management systems firstly.
I mean, we initially didn't want to get categorized as a fleet management system.
Right.
That's why we were always agile fleet intelligence.
Yeah.
But I think fleet management can take on a couple of different connotations as well. And I think, not with it's brought on, especially in the kind of the truck allocation or dispatch world, because those systems, typically the intelligence side of them hasn't been implemented or worked that well. I think there's been a lot of value creation that's come from engine data, but it's very finicky and it really only derives value for that single truck. So that's kind of the world that I'd park FMS in, is more around, yes, overall fleet function, but where the value sits within that, I think, is a very broad scope. It's I think it's not necessarily specific enough. And then, sorry, just the second.
The short interval control is the other one, maybe a bit broader.
Yes, yeah, and I think that also gets used. I think sometimes I think that's just used for like good shift coordination, right? Is like, if I can make this change, what impact will it have? And do we create enough visibility so that the individual who needs to make that decision can make it while being informed? I think David Dickinson, he spoke about that on your podcast an episode or two ago, and just the challenges, getting short interval control right is incredibly difficult. So I think if we can tie back and isolate let's focus on one lever at a time, right? So let's look at the trend analysis, understand what will have the biggest impact on your operations, and then just pick one of those things. So, and I think that's the trick, is to continuously go through and change what that should be. We've seen what we call cycle delays. It's kind of stationary time while the truck is full or empty. And guys become really focused on that for a month or two, and it makes incredible change. And then they focus on the next thing. And then they'll maybe look at queuing, and they'll maybe look at shift change and discipline around that, or availability. And I think that's just a cycle. Don't overload the production team with too many metrics. Drive one at a time.
In my mind, I know I'm probably oversimplifying, but I'm thinking the fleet management system talks about the availability. What's it doing, and is it being maintained, and is my fleet running well? Whereas my short interval control goes beyond, is it available, to is it being utilized well. And that's probably an oversimplification, but at least it gave me some categories to think in.
Yes. Yeah, I'd agree
so
with that.
Yeah, so if we move then on, and we're fast running out of time as well, maybe just, I always like to ask the question of your vision of the future. So if AVA Solutions got its way and all the mines in the world used your software, how does that change mining?
Well, I think we would have kind of the same efficiency that we're seeing in our mega mines in a lot of our smaller mines. So they'd be a lot more capital efficient. Um,
Right.
they tend to have, if you have smaller trucks, you tend to have more of them. And our
Mm,
strength really in emerging markets is that's a more risk averse way of deploying capitals to have
mm,
uh, lots more smaller capacity trucks. But those trucks, the interaction between them while mining has a
mm,
much bigger impact on the overall throughput of that. So I think the use of the data and how we deploy would resolve a lot of the drawbacks to having smaller fleets.
mm,
I think that
mm,
together with the rare earth minerals and the critical minerals will probably result in a form of retrofitted truck autonomous
mm,
trucks. I
mm,
think the capital deployment cycle is going to take too long. And, 5 years is very short, right? We 5 years ago, we sat here and we thought, oh, autonomous trucks are going to be so prolific that we'll be out of business.
mm,
And, now we've got the opportunity to actually do the brains and the allocation behind those autonomous trucks. And
mm,
that's something we're working with an American partner on. And so I think that there might be a movement towards that, but there's some
mm,
dependencies that are still need to be fixed around networking.
mm,
And then the world's scattered with failed POCs on
mm,
autonomous haul trucks. So,
mm,
we've got to make sure that there's a recipe there that we can replicate and deliver again and again and again. And
mm,
so I think in
mm,
the short term, probably 5 years, what we'll be looking at is really smooth, dynamic flow of trucks. And will
mhm,
be like a bit like a coordinated beehive working to move
mm,
material between the different locations. I think
mm,
the second part of it is we typically look at mine to market type solutions that have a level of optimization around material and grade. And then you
mhm.
typically have some intelligence that is allocating trucks to loaders based on the block model.
Yep.
And what we're really working on is how do we integrate those two models? And
Okay.
not to mention David again, but again, collapsing the life of mine model into the short interval control model and trying to
Oh yeah,
preserve
that
the
linking
optionality
those
of
two
the ore
is
body.
critical. Yeah.
Yeah. And the long-term optionality that comes with the ore body to the short-term execution and the costly
Mm,
tramming of excavators to new faces.
mm, mm,
I think I think we're right on the cusp of being able to do that because of the granular data. So I think in
mm,
5 years we'll probably see more optimization around bringing the mine to market world together with the input optimization.
mm.
And then post that, probably retrofitted autonomous trucks.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
I mean, you
That's
you hear a lot more of this than me.
yeah. Well, I mean, I almost want to be politician, say no, this is not me who have to answer the questions, you know. But I'll tell you some of my thoughts. I think that firstly, we've got to find a model that does not only serve greenfields projects, right? Because it's so often the case that mines have big money to spend when they spin up new projects, but it becomes much harder. You know, if an operation has been operating for a few years, and now technology, emerges that might improve things, but you've got built-in infrastructure and baked-in investments in different kinds of fleet and so on and so on. So to find a recipe that is truly OEM independent and that embraces global standards so that information can be exchanged up and down the mining value chain and up and down the planning horizon levels. That's got to be a way to really change the way that mines are operating, in the sense that it is not this complete dependence on the market always, but it is a little bit more mining what I have and selling it in a way that is profitable, as opposed to waiting for someone to offer a certain price before I throttle my production. I don't want to suggest an OPEC for mining, but there's got to be a way to change into order makers and not only order takers, a little bit more for mining, because those cycles inhibit a lot of innovation and a lot of progress in mining as well. But anyways,
I
so
was,
there's my
well, it might be. I was in Indonesia last week, and it
yeah.
looked like they might implement a coal cap there because the
Right.
war with Russia means that a lot of the Russian coal is now going into China, and so their
Mm,
primary market has been saturated. And so they were
mm,
looking at an OPEC-like coal cap.
mm,
And
mm,
it was an interesting podcast actually on Planet Money about the OPEC cap.
mm,
No one really sticks to it. And I was
mm,
wondering
mm,
how would you get multiple Indonesian miners to all stick to a cap? Uh,
mm, mm.
so I'm interested to
Yeah,
see if that plays out to see if it really works. Yeah.
I think that's maybe very easy in a world of kingdoms and let's call it centralized control environments like in the Middle East. Maybe little bit less easy to do when you've got lots of independent companies vying for the same money and the same market. But anyways, listen, we're out of time. I wanted to ask you two things. What's news when it comes to AVAS specifically? Is there anything new on the market? Anything new on the horizon that you're very excited on, working on, or planning to release anytime soon?
We've got a brand new AI agent called Eve. I
Ah,
think that idea that you can pop it up and it's amazing now is kind of even so many of our clients are running their own AI agents on
mm,
their local cell
mm,
phones actually and organizing their calendars with it. I think that's not necessarily the breakthrough part. What I think
mm.
is the breakthrough is that we're doing it on our own hosted graphics cards, our own H200s.
Oh, okay.
So what it means
Wow.
is that it's completely sanitary. So,
Mm,
in the early days, we would push the boundaries on hosting data in the cloud. We've managed to jump through many hoops of our clients, but now we're kind of honoring that. And we're saying, well,
mm,
we're keeping your data in a single instance for your account. And we'll make sure our agent is actually using your own data and APIs, and it models the role. So it means
mm.
you've got an AI. Eve is your mind manager, and it's doing its
There we
best
go.
to impersonate them. And it's contextualized with all of your own data from your
Mm.
mind plan to your current operating cycles. And we've added a WhatsApp interface to that. So now any
Wow.
mind manager in the pit can say, what should I
Mm.
do to improve the next shift? And it will give you precise feedback around individual assets on what they need to do to pick up the act.
Mm.
So very excited about that. That's coming along really well.
That sounds
And
very exciting.
we're piloting it at a couple of safe clients that
Mm.
are open to innovation and give that a shot.
Mm.
The second part is what I mentioned is working on autonomous haul truck dispatch, so adding
Okay.
that extra layer of intelligence to it,
Mm.
and those are the two elements.
I was thinking when I heard Eve, it puts a new face on women in mining. But then anyway,
And
if you can call Eve, in your case, a her, I don't know. But let's move on swiftly before we get into trouble.
yeah.
Jason, back to you personally. When you're not thinking of new ideas in technology and in mining and so on, what keeps you sane? What do you do to relax, and what do you do to keep the mind going?
Well, I've got three young daughters, so I try to find a few minutes free every now and again, but it's not often. At the
Mm.
moment, I'm doing a little bit of CrossFit and touch rugby.
Hmm.
Having moved to the UK, I've found touch rugby again, and it's quite a fun sport, and it's got a good gears. And
Hmm.
with being a South African, it comes with a predefined ability that you've got
Yeah.
to live up to, but it's quite fun.
And if you don't have it, you don't admit it.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Just find a club where it looks like you do.
Yeah, exactly. Jason, thank you so much for joining the MineWarp podcast, and all the best with all of your plans at Ava. And yeah, thank you for the innovation that you're bringing, and also I think contributing to that that ability to make technology available to more and more mining companies and operators out there.
Thanks, Ibi. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the podcast, what it does for the industry. We should have more open forums and more discussion.